Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Gin and Tonic podcast or show. Today, we're doing a pre-recorded one, as we all know. We're taking our semi-hiatus to do the pre-production for a lot of our stuff, so that's why you're listening to this pre-recorded. Today, we have a special guest, and I'll let the guest introduce himself. And later on, we'll get into the topic of the issue in Iran in Apostasy.
Hi, my name's Zamoon Johani. I'm a PhD student at La Trobe University in Australia, doing my research on the Iranian diaspora and pretty much the fragmentation behind it, the lack of unity in it, if you will. I'm half Kurdish, from Iraqi Kurdistan, and half Persian. And yeah, I've always very been interested in studying my homeland, my cultures, and the political challenges that we face in the Middle East.
Yeah, so one question, it's really exciting to hear about you doing your PhD, because the original, like we discussed previously, the original founder of this channel also started this channel as an extension of his PhD and doctoral thesis. So whenever he used to get his presentations or knowledge or something, he would always be talking to people. He was known as Klingshar in the start, but in real life it's Dr. Little. If he's not associated with the Klingshar name, I really don't want to be using it. That's why I call him Dr. Little. But yeah, so this channel's whole idea is for academic discussions and such.
Yeah, nice. No, it's good to hear. And I got to look like a bit more into this sort of stuff as well. Like his research and even theocracy, it's something in general that it's always sort of fascinated me to look into more. But yeah, no, we'd love to explore that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, and the first question I think we really got to get to, or a statement, is considering the people that we actually used to get on as well. Most people think that this is a ridiculous question to ask, but you'd be shocked at the answers we get. But would you say killing someone for apostasy is wrong?
Yeah, so of course, like for me, I'm not really a religious person, not really a spiritual person as well either. So religion for me is all about sort of, I can't know if there's a God or not. That's my opinion. I'm agnostic, so I don't want to step on anybody's toes and be like that there isn't. It's something for me that I feel like it's impossible to know. But what I do have a strong stance about is mixing religion with centralized politics, with forms of theocracy. It's when you're imposing that religious belief and value, which oftentimes is distorted as well. It's whatever you want to interpret, it's whatever you want to convey to suit your purposes of keeping power, of keeping a position. And that oftentimes leads to states and regimes that will execute en masse and then use their religion as an excuse. And so for me, of course, something like apostasy is morally wrong. Because oftentimes we see that the people who are the products of the people who are the victims of these executions or the victims of these legislations haven't really done anything wrong. And I'm sure we'll get into a bit more as well. We're looking at women in Iran who, don't wear a hijab or who go out to the streets and protest, or men who are exercising their civil liberties. And this apparently means that it's something against God and they deserve punishment. So yeah, for me, of course, it's not something that I think is morally correct at all.
Yeah, no, because the reason why we asked that is in Iran, I don't think apostasy is outright illegal. Yet, considering the topic we're doing today, it's not like apostates are getting arrested. They're straight up getting murdered. Whether by the government or by vigilantes. So this highly militant style executions of people who uh, it's not even doing blasphemy straight out like what people in Charlie Hebdo were doing. It's just wishing for your own personal freedoms, and to be executed for something essentially for even like what you said, which I think most of the audience would believe is very reasonable. Even what you would say would probably get you in trouble in Iran, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that we're trying to look at here. So I actually have a article here from the European Union for the Agency of Asylum. So let me just pull that up.
Yeah, nice. I'll pull it up as well.
Yeah, so I'm showing it on the screen. So the people who are watching this on YouTube will see it on the screen. But if you want to pull it up on your end too, we can take a look at it together. So I kind of see the first definition that they have of persons who are considered to have abandoned or renounced their religious belief as a principle of Islam is apostasy. And then those who disbelieve or lack belief the existence of God or gods are atheists. And people who, or persons who have spoken sacrilegiously about God or Islam is considered blasphemy. So I actually agree with those definitions as well, coming from like a definition, like from their perspective, but I think it's, as a compromise, we can come to an understanding that these are correct definitions. So just coming off of that, I know what the media actually says, or what we would find from agencies, might be different than what the actual situation would be. And especially this being last updated on June 2019. What would you say is the most updated situation on ground, or from your knowledge? And would you say that this article is understanding of that?
So in terms of how the Islamic regime applies, I guess, apostasy?
Yeah, so the whole view of what apostasy would be, and I know they talk about the conversion, especially in 2015, the Kurdish Christian groups being converted and such in the hundreds. So these statistics being from 2015 might be outdated. So what would you say is the ground reality presently as compared to this?
Well, I guess it's interesting because the Islamic regime, so going back to what I was saying before, again, they're concerned with the preservation of their power. And there's one thing that I think that they've learned during the previous dictatorship in Iran. So we're talking about Mohammad Reza Shah, the Pahlavi dynasty, which went from 1925 to 1979, was that at times it was a dictatorship, but at times they were lenient towards their opposition as well. Not necessarily towards the leftists. With the leftists, they were very tough, they were strict, they would mass imprison them. But with the Islamists, they weren't as strict. They would bring them into prison, they would release them at times, they would largely ignore them. Mohammad Reza Shah, the last king of Iran, even in the beginning, he cozied up with them. And when it came to the 1979 revolution, Mohammad Reza Shah didn't stay and fight. He left the country. He kind of realized, hey, the situation's gone awry now. Like, it's my time to go. You know, it's too late now. So how this factors into the Islamic regime is that if they've learned a lesson from that time, it's that leniency, in their perspective, is going to result in a revolution. It's going to result in a successful revolution. So they've been very strict. They've expanded all the institutions of terror back from the previous dictatorship, and they've made it much more explicit. They've made it much more strengthened. And it's in my perspective that they use the discourse of Islam to justify a lot of these things. So when it comes to protests, when it comes to mass mobilizations of people in Iran, one of the ways that they, I guess, justify the execution of protesters, of people on the ground, of women, is by using this language of apostasy. It's by using the language of, and I think it even says it in this article here, speaking sacrilegiously about God or Islam. And so they really intensify this narrative every time there is a set of mobilizations in Iran. And that's it for them. They don't want to appear soft. They want to ingrain the terror into the Iranian people. And religion and what they build their government around is the discourse that they will use to justify that. Now, in terms of actually on the ground and how different religious groups and all that are treated, we know that the Baha'is in Iran, which is a relatively new religion as well. Like, I think it's only like 150 or so years old. Actually a Baha'i in real life. But yeah, we know that the Islamic regime, they're horrible Baha'is. They've mass persecuted Baha'is. Even during the 1979 revolution, pogroms and so forth were very common in these areas. They view them really as like enemies of Islam, to the point that even Jewish Iranians are actually treated better than Baha'is, for instance. And then on the ground, we see there are structural discriminations against non-Shia sects of Islam as well. There's barely a Sunni mosque in Tehran, for instance, or Balochistan and Iranian Kurdistan, two Sunni regions in Iran, are two of the most economically impoverished. But yeah, it's that they use this language to justify their terror. They use the terror to stay in power. They're afraid of using that power. And they really have it out for anyone that's not Shia as well.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot. So we have a moderator. We have a frequent guest culture, Jenny. We love him, but as he says, it's not always as simple, and politics is complex. So knowing that there is a complexity to it, we can see that there's multiple people involved in it. So, for example, the Iraqi state, the Popular Mobilization Units and Tribal Mobilization Militia, Kurdistan Regional Government Authorities, and ISIL, or the Islamic State of Iraq, and the Levant, and other non-state actors. So maybe if we can also like give an explanation of who all these places or people are, because obviously when we were there, or the Western forces were there, obviously we weren't fighting with all of these people. We were having some assistance from, we were either providing assistance to the Iraqi security forces, or we had other paramilitary operations against certain individual groups. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So we really have to go back to 1979, right? And we see the revolution, the so-called revolution, is successful. A lot of Iranians actually call it the devolution, which I think is more accurate. And we see Ayatollah Khomeini, he comes into power, the supreme leader, right? And he starts talking about exporting revolutionary Shia jihad in the Middle East. And this is a policy that continued in Palestine, although they weren't Shia, or the groups, they're like Fatah in the beginning, they weren't Shia groups. It was about supporting Islamic Jihad and resistance struggles that they saw against the West or against their enemies like Israel. And then time develops, they start creating essentially Hezbollah in Lebanon. They start funding them. I mean, now Hezbollah in Lebanon, one of one of the most powerful Shia forces in Lebanon, alongside Amal, is pretty much directly funded and supplied by the Islamic regime. And Hezbollah has become so powerful, they're now pretty much in the government of Lebanon. They have extensive influence in the south. And what we've seen in Iraq is that during this ISIS conflict, and really accelerating from 2015, 2016, the Islamic regime saw an opportunity, They see Iraq, they see that quite a substantial amount of this population are Shia, and they work with forces there, with leaders there, like Nur al-Maliki, to create Shia paramilitary forces. Their justification is that, they're fighting ISIS. This is to safeguard the Iraqi people against ISIS. And then all of a sudden, this Popular Mobilization Force is much more even powerful than the Iraqi government at times, the Iraqi army, in combating ISIS. But this is the thing, the Islamic regime really consolidates its discourse in a time of conflict, right? So we look at the Israel-Palestinian conflict, they see an opportunity to go into that. Hamas comes into existence, they mass fund it. We see the Lebanese civil war, that's an opportunity for the Islamic regime to create Hezbollah in this discourse of defending the Shias of Lebanon. We see ISIS in Iraq, the Islamic regime comes in and creates the Popular Mobilization Forces. And then within Iran, whenever a conflict springs up, that's when, like I was saying before, they use this discourse of apostasy. So it's really like that theocracy at times is intertwined with this discourse of conflict. And funnily enough, even recently, in the Sunni parts of Iranian Kurdistan, when protests were at their peak 4 or 5 months ago, there was even reports that the Iranian government brought in forces from Hezbollah and the Popular Mobilization Front outside of Iran into Iran and surrounded these Kurdish cities and villages. So for them, it's they have this almost like this trans-Islamist sort of approach to the Middle East. And it's quite dangerous, as we've seen as well. It's undermined Iraq's sovereignty, it's undermined Lebanon's sovereignty. And it's a force that they can use if something happens in Iran as well.
Yeah, so just as a question that arises from that, how much would you say is the religious aspect, or how much would you say religion plays into much of this, and how much would you say it's just a political power play, like a modern day version of Game of Thrones?
And see, that's a really interesting question as well, because it's something that I genuinely wonder too. How much of it is this religious discourse, how much of it is geopolitics, but I think it goes hand in hand. And especially with theocracies, when you combine religion with state authority, then religion in of itself becomes a centralized power. You create mechanisms to enforce it, to enforce your idea of it, right? It becomes a way of exercising power, sometimes violence. And in of that, then religion becomes intertwined with geopolitics as well. So the way that the Islamic regime functions with its theocracy is interdependent with its own geopolitics. Whereas we see with the Shah's dictatorship, he had this foreign policy approach that was about playing two sides, He would send some support to the Israelis, he would send some support to the Palestinians, he would sometimes, he would have relations, even during World War II, they tried to balance between Nazi Germany and the British. So the Shahs always had this thing about balancing their foreign policy. Whereas with Ayatollah Khomeini, it was clear from the very beginning when he talked about exporting revolutionary Shia jihad across the Middle East, then the very foundations of their theocracy, of the way they interpret their religion, is intertwined with geopolitics. That's the path they chose.
Yeah, and what really gets me is because I know the central area, this is also in like the Baghdad belt and such, that a lot of this plays out. Knowing full well that Baghdad, until very recently as well, was a center for commerce and scholarly activity. Yet for the situation to now turn into this. For me, it feels very sad as a history buff to know the kind of rich history in the area, then to also see it get demolished. It really does hurt, and I'm sure that you probably share that same feeling about this whole situation.
No, for sure. I mean, Naomi Klein describes it in a book, The Shock Doctrine, that when the US invaded Iraq, one of the first things they bombed was the Grand Library of Baghdad, right? And it's sad. It's because, these places of rich history that have extended back centuries upon centuries are now caught up in this war of geopolitics. And whether that's, defended by the West in this language of liberalizing and dropping 5,000 pounds of freedom and McDonald's on the poor people of the Middle East, or whether that's justified by the Islamic regime as this revolutionary Shia jihad against the West, or as Israel, through their annexation policies, and the fact that they were the true inhabitants, they're returning to their colony. We're seeing the eradication of so many beautiful sites and history in the Middle East.
Yeah, and the Baghdad region, I think it's either on the Silk Road or adjacent to the Silk Road as well. I know, so there was a lot of trade, so I think this is going to seem very far-fetched, but I find the bombing of that library in Baghdad almost equivalent to the Romans burning the Library of Alexandria, where it almost set engineering and science back several years, considering the kind of knowledge and trade that was happening in that region.
Yeah.
So it really was something that gets me to this day.
Yeah.
Now, for the protectors, I know the U.S. went there and did its own thing, but here we see that they outline the state, or the Iraqi state, or the KRG, and then they have the other parties and organizations. So, are these the only two protection actors of protection, or would there be more on ground level?
In terms of sort of protecting U.S. interests in Iraq?
More so just the actors of protection against the said actors of persecution or serious harm, like the ISIL or other figures that were present.
Oh, like, is there sort of any other, sort of controversial groups in Iraqi? Oh, yeah. And figures in the Iraqi context.
Yeah, essentially in the story we read the antagonists, but is there protagonists in a sense?
Oh, like the sort of the good guys, right?
Yeah, the good guys or the people who are supposed to cheer on, even though there is no good people in war.
I mean, it's tough because, I'm an I'm an anarchist myself, so I think the nature of centralized politics in of itself leads to corruption, leads to violence, to sustain on violence, and there's always varying degrees of good and bad in everything. Now, my own personal experience, like I said, my mum is from Iraqi Kurdistan, and I definitely have sympathy for the Kurdish groups in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Peshmergas, as we call them, which in Kurdish means those who face death, are sort of our fighters, our guerrilla fighting units. They did an amazing job fighting against ISIS, especially given that 30 years before that, they were facing a genocide, literally, by Saddam Hussein. And so, at least for me, I can say that they were the good guys. But even that, it gets muddled up. Going back to what I was saying before, nothing is ever perfect. It's difficult to project a very romanticized lens, because even with the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga, we saw that when ISIS... So I actually know this because I spent time doing documentary work in Iraqi Kurdistan. I was doing filming in refugee camps. And one of the refugee camps we visited and really did a lot of documentary work on were Yazidis. And Yazidis, for the viewers who don't know, it's this very ancient religion that was practiced by the Kurds. It's quite fascinating as well. But Islam, a lot of sort of Islamic sects see it as going back to apostasy, or see it as like sacrilegious, and sort of see them as like devil worshippers is the term that they use. Shaitan paras, as we would say. And so these Yazidis, they faced persecution for thousands of years, right? Constant persecutions and genocides. So going back to this point, these Yazidis, they were nestled in Shengal Mountain, and they knew an ISIS assault was coming. And at that time, Shengal was protected by the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga. And they told the Peshmerga, they're like, look, ISIS is coming, they're getting closer and closer to us, let us escape. But the Peshmerga literally told them, no, it will look bad on us if we couldn't defend you. We promise we'll protect you, stay in your city, stay in your town, stay in Shengal, and we'll fight off ISIS. Come 5 a.m. in the morning when ISIS arrives, and the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga flees. And ISIS comes to a bunch of Yazidis who are unarmed and pretty much enacts another genocide. Takes slaves. So even in this discourse, where even me, I want to be empathetic to the Iraqi Kurds, the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga, well, they pretty much were one of the reasons for facilitating the genocide of Yazidis by ISIS. And of course, this is, again, where Kurdish geopolitics gets really crazy and complex, because one of the ways the Yazidis managed to find a haven was because another Kurdish group, the PKK, opened a corridor for them into Syria, and they saved quite a bit of them as well. And so when I rocked up to these Yazidi camps, people had the most hate, like the biggest hatred for the Iraqi Kurdish government over what happened. But they saw the PKK as saviors as well. So it gets tough, like, who are really the good guys in any conflict? Like, it's difficult, in general. My only thing is that I sort of sympathize with the people on the ground. I went to refugee camps where there were both Shia and Sunni Arabs who, even till this day, 7 years later, haven't returned to their areas, haven't returned to their hometowns. ISIS is gone, but the Iraqi government or the Iraqi Kurdish government haven't done any rebuilding efforts, so why would you return to rubble? So it's tough, but when we see a conflict when there's an actor like ISIS, where there's a Shia parliamentary force like the Popular Mobilization Front, which was literally tying Sunni Arabs to their car and dragging them across the city, then we could maybe say we can give the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga some slack, but again, that doesn't excuse what happened in Shengal. And it's something that, they're very ashamed about as well, because there's all these different levels of authority, and some authorities were very much against it and others weren't. And it's also the same thing that happened with the Iraqi government in Mosul. I mean, that's when ISIS first got its big strength in Iraq. They literally rocked up to Mosul the Iraqi army, which was mostly led by Shia Arabs, were like, fuck this, we're not going to defend Mosul. And they left the Sunni Arabs there for ISIS to take over. So it's tough.
Yeah, no, I really sympathize with those people, and I think at this point, like, since we covered the history, it's not something that stopped previously, because according to the article from the Human Rights Watch, which we also discussed, as of May 12th, 2023, from 2 weeks prior to that, 60 people have been executed for essentially performing blasphemy. And this included an Iranian Swedish national as well on alleged terror charges. Now, why is it that such regimes have a blasphemy law where no other, under international law, none of this kind of death penalties have existed?
Well, it's really about the nature of authoritarian states. Look at North Korea. Look at what China's doing to Uyghurs and Xinjiang. Look at all these different regions. Governments will use different discourses to justify their acts of violence and terror. And in the Iranian case, it really is that this discourse of revolutionary Shia Islam is the language they've used to justify their violence, their terror, to remain in power. Because the Islamic regime, they can't reform. The moment they try to reform, they're showing weakness to the Iranian people, and that's when the Iranian people can go in for the last push. That's when they can take them out. And so it needs to, in its own perspective, it needs to keep enforcing terror, because that is the only vehicle it has from preventing a revolution happening. That is why it's so violent. And so we even saw this in 1977, the last king of Iran. He brings in a guy who previously he tried to have hunt down and killed, Bakhtiari. He brings him to power and he says, hey, do a bunch of reforms. Try to avert this revolution from happening. And that was what showed the weakness of the Pahlavi regime. That's what allowed the Iranians to mobilize and overthrow that government. And so when it comes to the Islamic regime, this language of blasphemy, this language of apostasy, which again is really intensified during protests, it's their way of sustaining power, so the language that they use. And it's something you'll find, just copy paste this anywhere to any authoritarian regime. Of course, there's different levels. I mean, Iran has the second highest execution rates in the world. It usually sits around 300 to 350, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and China's at the top. And the only reason China's at the top is because they've got more than 1 billion people. We've got like 70 million. If we did it by per capita, Iran would probably be right up on the list. And that's the thing, is these people in charge, they are some of the worst batch of Shia Islamist politicians from the Shah's time, because there were actually some decent people. There were some decent clerics. There were clerics that were even against the Islamic regime. There were clerics that were initially in support of it, like Ayatollah Montazeri, who years down the line, he's like, wait, this is the Islamic regime we've built? All this execution and killing and terror? And then clerics like that get sidelined and pushed away. So the remainance of what we have now is this very extremist Shia clerics who, even against their own, who criticize the direction they take, they push them aside. They might not execute them, but they'll put them under house arrest, they'll make sure they'll bury them somewhere where no one can go, and they'll completely sideline them. They are fanatical people. So yeah, it's quite an unfortunate reality. We're literally run by maniacs. Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's a specific quote on this article here. I'll read it out for the audience as well, just in case anyone's watching via audio. Iranian authorities are apparently using executions and an inhumane punishment following unfair trials as a show of force against its own people, who are demanding fundamental change, said Tara Sefri Far, senior Iran researcher at Human Rights Watch. The international community should unequivocally condemn this terrifying trend and press Iranian professionals to halt these executions. Now, I know America and foreign intervention has really, for lack of a better term, fucked up that area. But these kind of executions in authoritarian regimes are clearly wrong. So what sort of gameplay do you think we should have against this kind of stuff? Because obviously there are people in that area that do say that they want help to get rid of this, and I agree, they do deserve help, but what sort of extent of help should be presented?
Yeah. It's a tough one. I know definitely that sanctions are ineffective, right? Because sanctions, you're just punishing the ordinary people of Iran. My own family in Iran, I know people in Iran who are struggling, who have very much struggled the past 10, 12 years because of sanctions. So sanctions are, if anything, they're even counterproductive. I mean, we look at the sanctions that we've given to Russia, and all that's done is allowed Russia to prop up its own industry. It takes over McDonald's and whatever foreign multinational company and it rebrands it as its own. It allows the Russian state to exert more control over its economy and kick out foreign influences. So sanctions, I want to clarify, just regular sanctions are ineffective. Because at the end of the day, they're just going to hurt ordinary people. And that is a route that Western countries love taking, whether it's Cuba with embargoes and sanctions, whether it's Iran. And it does nothing but, in my opinion, it empowers those regimes. It allows those regimes to say, look, we have a very visible force outside our country who is punishing people like you. Now, in terms of effective actions, it's difficult. Like, what could we say? Some people say, maybe the US should start funding Kurdish groups from across the border to go in and give them military supplies. Well, that's also going to be very difficult as well. Because Iranians don't want an armed conflict. Iranians don't want an armed revolution. They want something that where the population mobilizes and they can take out the Islamic regime, and it goes through. So when we're asking for support, the support that we're really asking for is really targeting the entities of the Islamic regime. It's the designation of the Islamic regime's the IRGC, the main ideological unit of the IR that's in task of defending the regime. It's designating them as a terrorist organization, which America has done, but other Western countries are just not. I've tried to do this battle in Australia with the Australian parliaments, and it looked like it was going to get through, and it didn't. In the European Union, it looked like it was going to get through a few months ago, and it didn't. So really, it's about targeting the key institutions of the Islamic regime and not applying these broad sanctions that just affect everyone. It's about political sponsorships of people on death row. Sure, they might not do much. I mean, there was people like Majid Kazemi who got executed a few weeks ago who were on political sponsorships, but at least it gets an awareness going. At least it pushes that narrative to people in the West about what's going on in Iran. But it's tough in terms of what the West can do because, like you pointed out, you don't want the West meddling too much because when they do that, then we end up with Iraq. We end up with copy-paste failed state. But but we also don't want actions that just impact regular Iranians for no reasons. If we want any actions, it's the direct targeting of IR institutions. And even more importantly, it's not having the Islamic regime in the Human Rights Council in the United Nations, which is a complete joke. It's not doing actions that completely, piss on Iranian people's faces. So it's, yeah.
I would like to just ask as a comparison as well. Would you say ISIL and other other groups like that are to the authoritarian regime in Iran as the SS would be for Nazi Germany? In a sense, where are they doing this purely on an ideological level, or are they doing genocide on a race-based thing as well?
Like ISIS.
Yeah, ISIL or other kinds of
Of these sort of groups.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're doing genocide. I mean, these groups are even so fringe that sometimes even Al Qaeda has an issue with them. If you've got Al Qaeda say, hey man, maybe relax a little bit, then you know you've got a problem, right? If you've got a fringe Islamist terrorist group saying that. No, ISIS is very indiscriminatory. As I've described the Yazidis, it was blatant genocide. They were taking women as slaves. They would use them as sex slaves. They would force them to convert. I've seen footages of mass executions of Yazidis. It's horrible. It's a very genocidal thing behind them. In one sense, it's like trans-Islamic, because ISIS was composed of fighters from across the Middle East, Africa, even Chechnya. I mean, you had a lot of Chechen fighters, Dagestani fighters, and ISIS as well. But yeah, the way they target groups they see as apostates or anyone who disagrees with them, or a Christian town that refuses to bow down to them or to convert to their weird Salafist religion, then it's ethnic cleansing, then it's massacre, then it's genocide. So yeah, I think it's a good comparison to the SS. No, for sure.
Yeah, we originally thought that the death count or the executions were around 350 people, but in 2022, according to the Human Rights Activist News Agency, it says here in 2022, the Iranian authorities executed 565 people, including 5 who were under 18 at the time.
Yeah.
And then between January 1st to May 5th, Iran executed at least 192 people, including 8 women.
Yeah, and those statistics usually have an asterisk on them as well, because there's countless of other people they can't account for, too, that would have been executed as well, because the regime oftentimes just buries them out in some random mass grave as well. I mean, even the 1988 mass executions of political prisoners in Iran, the figures vary from 10,000 to 30,000. And the official sources are like very minimal, they're nothing, and then on the other side we've got 30,000, sometimes even higher. But yeah, of course, I think even in this year so far, we've had around 250, maybe a bit more executions, and in May, it was like 150, 160 executions so far just in May. And most of those were, a lot of them were drug charges as well, but public hangings. Literally a week ago, somebody was publicly hanged in Iran off a crane. Can you imagine seeing that in the West? Can you imagine just going to a Walmart, you're coming out, and you just see a crane, hanging someone? Yeah, especially as a kid, and that's what I mean. It goes back to this point we were talking about earlier. These executions, it doesn't matter if it's drug charges, doesn't matter if there's apostasy, they send a clear message of don't retaliate, don't push back against us, don't undermine our sovereignty. Else, and they send these messages through public executions, through public killings, through the killings of children. Like Kian during the protest, it was like 9 years old. So yeah, it's barbarity beyond words. And apparently this qualifies them to be on the United Nations Council for Human Rights. So that's the hypocrisy of the West.
Oh yeah, I see so many Salafi Dawa guys that talk so much crap about the West, but when the stuff happens, the famous ones being Ali Dawa, Muhammad Hijab, Daniel Hakikachu, I haven't seen them put one episode or one video condemning this.
Mm.
And magically, when Pride Month happens, by the time Pride Month even hits, they're putting out 10 videos talking about how LGBTQ is bad. Yet, somehow, magically, this issue goes over their head like nothing happened.
Yeah. Because it's a narrative that fits their discourse. And we have this polarizing thing where it's like, just because I'm anti-West doesn't mean I have to be pro-Russia, pro-China, pro-Iran, pro-North Korea. But we have this tendency, even amongst the left, tankies, right? So Stalinists, for instance. I know Stalinism isn't like a consolidated political ideology, but just the association of that, the ideas with that. I've got Stalinist friends. I don't mind. I've got mates on the right wing. I've got mates all across the political spectrum. It's not an issue for me. But they're talking about all these abuses that the US has done all across the Middle East. Yet for them, the salvation or the good guys is Bashar Assad. It's Iran. It's North Korea. It's these countries. I mean, is it so hard to understand that politics, that geopolitics, that political empires, global powers can both engage in shitty behavior, that maybe none of them are good, but it's just taking whatever fits your narrative and ignoring anything that doesn't. I've seen people try to excuse the Islamic regime as well, and they're constantly talking about the West. And for me, it's like, well, is the West pushing them to execute these people? Or I've seen so-called communists defending the Islamic regime. I'm like, try being a communist in Iran. See how long you last. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like, you've pointed out with these people as well, and I don't actually know of them. I'm kind of keen to sort of check them out as well, just to see sort of what their narrative is like. But it's disgusting, because that shit doesn't just happen on one side, it happens on both.
Yeah, and one thing I find really bullshit in terms of like the statement they give is so according to the UN here, so in his annual report on the question of the death penalty in August 2020, the United Nations Secretary General himself asserted his stance that capital punishment should especially not be imposed as a sanction for forms of non-violent conduct, such as apostasy, blasphemy, adultery, and consensual same-sex relations. He further expounded on this assertion in September 2021, stressing that he opposes the use of death penalty in all circumstances and urges state actors to adopt moratorium on the carrying out of the death penalty. They say this, yet Iran is still being able to present themselves. So would you say that this is hypocrisy, or that you think that he genuinely believes this stuff, or?
It's politics. It's all politics, and I think, to an extent, I don't want to sound like a loony right now, but to an extent, a destabilized Middle East is something that is good for global powers, like Russia, like China, like America. Although I'll make an argument that America post 9/11 has been more scared about intervening in the Middle East, especially with its withdrawals in Afghanistan and Afghanistan. It's sort of seen its policy failures. But destabilization is good because it gives an excuse for global powers to come in. And behind the doors, behind the UN doors, who knows what's going on? If they're releasing statements like this, general secretaries are saying stuff like this, but Iran's still on these councils, then something is happening behind the doors. There's still a political reason that they need Iran. That they need, sorry, not even Iran, the Islamic regime. And yeah, that's why politics is a mess. And as an anarchist, that's where I say, you got to decentralize. That politics, that decentralization of politics, of power, is always going to lead to some sort of violence, some sort of subjugation. And that's just the dirty nature of politics. It's power. It's corruption. It's like a poison.
Yeah. And this other statement here is what gets me as well. So currently there are 6 nations that maintain the death penalty for apostasy only. So Malaysia, Maldives, Qatar, Somalia, UAE, and Yemen. Additionally, there are 7 countries which maintain the death penalty for both apostasy and blasphemy: Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. The most recent removal from this list of nations that prescribe the capital punishment for apostasy is Sudan, which civilian-led transitional government ratification the Miscellaneous Amendments Act in July 2020, which included provisions of eliminating the crime of apostasy. First of all, do you recognize a pattern in this? And second of all, why do you think that these specific countries hold this kind of view?
Yeah, I mean, all the countries you listed out, they're definitely not progressive countries at all. I mean, Malaysia's a bit more interesting in that it sort of had this weird intersection between civil democracy and Sharia sort of law, or sort of like Islamic culture, I would say, is probably more accurate. And that's one of the more progressive Islamic countries as well. There's still sort of there's still some form of discrimination against sort of like non-Sunni populations. Shias, for instance, can't really do their religious ceremonies and stuff, but it's a bit better. But yeah, we look at all of these countries, any of them democratic? Brunei, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran? No. And that's the thing, is, again, it goes back to my thing, is one of the ways that these authoritarian states remain in power is terror. And to use terror, you need some sort of discourse. And they might genuinely believe in this as well. Of course, I don't want to undermine that. But it's just an instrument. It's a way for them to stay in power. And none of these states are progressive. I mean, Sudan even... it's an example of them leaving it, but it's also a sad example because they've disintegrated into pretty much another civil war, the beginnings of it as well. So yeah, it's tough. I think really that religion and politics, they need to stay clear out of each other, but that doesn't guarantee some sort of secular amazing progressive state as well. It's really the style of the government, the function of it. And authoritarian regimes would just, use one discourse or another to justify terror.
For sure. So yeah, in conclusion, that area has a very bad reputation for this stuff. It needs to be condemned. And killing people for purely their belief is wrong. I mean, I could understand, if you're making, really vulgar cartoons or ripping up the holy book or something. I can see how that would cause offense for some people. But if you're going to kill someone for that, the person who's ripping the Quran isn't the one that needs the help. It's you that wants to kill them for it. That needs the help, in my opinion. And
for sure.
I wouldn't say that an average person following the faith would also be having this issue, because as we've seen, they're getting killed quite regularly in terms of like genocides. It's more the authoritarian powers that want power to hold their power to.
You've brought up an interesting example as well, because we see this sometimes exercised by non-state actors, by people, but the state's discourse actively promotes this sort of violence. So, and a good example of this is India. I mean, how often does it happen in India in a year where some Muslim person is killed because of mob violence? Because they're like, oh, he slaughtered a cow. Oh, he was blasphemous to the Hindu ideology, or they did this, or they did that. And so, in those instances, sure, it's not the government actively going out and killing Muslims. I mean, they are in Kashmir, that's a whole other thing, but the ideological underpinnings of that government, the Hindutva, the extreme Hindu nationalism, actively promotes this sort of behavior by non-state actors. And so it's something that happens both on a state level and on the ground. And when it happens on the ground, it's usually because the country itself promotes that sort of idea as well. So it's less visible. You know, maybe India doesn't actively do this, doesn't actively execute people for blasphemy, but its very ideas pushed into the society cause these things to happen as well. So it even expands beyond these 7 or 8 countries. It accounts for so many countries in the world, even Pakistan. It happens every now and then as well.
Yeah, so on this topic, would there be any closing statements or something that you want to give as like final thoughts on the whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, for me, respecting religion is important. As you pointed out, look, maybe somebody burning the Quran, that's not good behavior, right? Like, that, it's disrespectful. You need to have respect. I think religion needs to be something that's interpersonal. If it can even be decentralized from governing authorities or systems of power, which is hard to do, of course. There's churches, there's mosques, there's all these different things. But there needs to be a thing that, hey, I respect your religion, you respect my religion. And that goes for even people, for instance, in France. If you're, like, okay, now I'm referring to Charlie Hebdo. If you're burning the Quran, not to justify what happened to them, it was horrible, but surely you know that that act in of itself is going to invite very serious and violent repercussions. Not that they should be banned from doing that. Freedom of speech is important, freedom of expression is very important as well. And also, like you pointed out, it's the people who actively go and commit these acts of violence against them, for killing somebody, for burning their book. They're the ones who need help even more as well. So in situations like that, it's important to have that respect and to somebody else's faith. But if you do engage in behavior like this and you're killed for it, then ultimately there's something wrong with the way people treat that as well. Don't be provocative, but if someone's being provocative, don't go out and kill them for that as well. And in terms of my general conclusions on Iran, look, it's been more than 7-8 months now since the revolution has started. We've seen, ever since 2009, revolutions happening, protests, mass mobilizations happening in Iran every 2-3 years. But people are increasingly getting tired of their regime, of the government that's hijacked the whole population. Actually, I saw a report, I forgot to mention this, but I think 50,000 of Iran's 70 or 80,000 mosques have closed down because increasingly people in Iran are becoming irreligious. They've had such a horrible experience with this regime there. Not necessarily doesn't mean they're not Muslims anymore, but they're not practicing as much. A lot of Iranians now don't do their Friday prayers, which is important in Islam. So we're seeing a cultural shift happening in Iran. We've seen a revolution that sparked in September of last year, and every week, every Friday, we see protests happen in Iran, in Zahedan. We see acts of resistance. There was a political prisoner who, a few days ago, he could have a guest over to go see him in prison, and he held up a sign saying these cowards won't rule us for much longer. So have faith in Iranian people. We don't want this regime to stay in power. We will overthrow them. And it's not me. I'm in diaspora, but the people in Iran, it's not something they can take for much longer. But at the same time, a message to the Western countries: stop intervening in the Middle East, and don't fucking have Iran on the human rights body. Don't engage in behavior with the Islamic regime. Don't be like these European countries where you say all these great things in support of the protests of Iran, and then the next week you go and shake hands with authorities of the Islamic regime. And don't put sanctions on us, please. That would be great as well. Thank you very much.
For sure. So this was a great podcast, guys, and you're in the Discord. So we recorded this in the Discord podcast voice chat. So for future episodes, whenever we want to record something like this for pre-recording, we'll be in this channel, and you see anyone there, you guys can always jump in as an audience and give your opinion too for the recording. But in any case, take care, guys, and we'll see you in the next episode.